On a seemingly peaceful afternoon at the bustling mall, Ruby Jenkins, a dignified, elderly black woman, found her day take a dark turn. Just as she prepared to leave, two security guards intercepted her, accusing her of theft despite her protests and receipt in hand. Little did they know, a simple phone call would summon a fierce protector, and what started as humiliation would end in a dramatic lesson in justice. The mall was bustling with its usual rhythm, people moving about with shopping bags, chatting, and exchanging laughs. Among the crowd was Mrs. Ruby Jenkins, a woman who stood out with her calm presence and warm demeanor. She was a woman of 70, yet her posture, while not as upright as it once had been, radiated grace. Her soft, silver-gray hair was pinned back neatly, and she wore a light blue sweater that matched the gentle look in her eyes. With her cane clicking softly on the polished floor, Mrs. Ruby walked through the aisles, taking her time. This was her weekly outing. Every Thursday afternoon, she'd walk to the local mall, take a few hours to browse, pick up her favorite tea, fresh vegetables, some bread, and milk. To most, it would seem mundane, but to Mrs. Ruby, it was a comforting ritual. It was her way of maintaining independence, a quiet rebellion against her aging body. As she finished up her shopping, she approached the cashier, counting her items carefully as she unloaded them onto the counter. She greeted the cashier with a warm smile and paid for everything with exact change, placing her receipt carefully in her handbag before gathering her bags. The trip was nearly over, and she felt the familiar warmth of satisfaction that came from completing her small tasks. She knew she would go home, put her groceries away, and enjoy a peaceful cup of tea by her window, watching the leaves drift lazily from the trees. Just as she reached the mall's exit, she paused, taking a deep breath to savor the moment. The hum of activity around her felt like music, a reminder of life's simple pleasures. She exhaled slowly, her eyes closing momentarily, lost in the calmness. Then, unexpectedly, the moment was shattered. "Ma'am, we need to talk to you," a stern voice said from behind her. Mrs. Ruby turned, startled, to see two security officers in dark uniforms standing in her path. They were large men, towering over her, with cold, unyielding expressions that turned her moment of peace into one of anxiety. One of them, with arms crossed tightly over his chest, continued, "We've received a report that you were shoplifting." Mrs. Ruby blinked, the accusation landing like a harsh slap across her face. Shoplifting? She felt her heart skip a beat, confusion mingling with disbelief. She had been so meticulous, so careful. She couldn't remember ever even brushing against anyone's belongings, let alone taking something that wasn't hers. Her voice, gentle and quivering, found its way out. "Excuse me? I don't understand." The second officer, his face hard and expressionless, added in a clipped tone, "We need you to come with us." Without waiting for her response, they stepped closer, blocking any hope of escape. Mrs. Ruby felt her grip on her cane tighten as a flicker of fear ignited within her. Her legs felt weak beneath her as the gravity of the situation began to settle. "I've done nothing wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "Please check my bag. I have my receipt. I paid for everything." Ignoring her words, one officer reached out, grabbing her arm roughly. The strength of his grip shocked her, a reminder of how frail her body was compared to theirs. She flinched, nearly dropping her cane as she struggled to steady herself. "Let me go," she gasped, her eyes wide with fear, but her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The world around her started to blur as her heart pounded against her ribs. She glanced around the mall, desperately searching for someone to intervene. She saw people staring, some murmuring to each other, others looking at her with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Not a single person moved to help her. She felt the sting of humiliation mix with her fear. How had it come to this? She had never been in trouble before, never done anything that could bring shame upon herself or her family. Yet here she was, being treated like a criminal, dragged away by men who looked at her as though she were less than human. In her frantic state, her purse slipped from her shoulder, and her phone fell to the floor with a soft thud. One of the officers continued to pull her toward a back corridor, oblivious to the tears welling in her eyes, or to the fact that her phone lay there on the floor, her last lifeline. But Mrs. Ruby noticed, and in that fleeting moment of hope, she remembered her son, Oliver. Her dear, protective son. Oliver had always told her to call him if she ever needed help, and right now, she needed him more than ever. With a surge of resolve, she twisted in the officer's grip, reaching for her phone. Her hands shook, but she managed to grab it, fingers trembling as she struggled to unlock the screen. The officers were still dragging her, oblivious to her actions. Desperately, she dialed Oliver's number. Her heart raced as the phone rang, her hope clinging to each ring, praying he would answer. And then, she heard his voice, strong and steady, the sound that had always made her feel safe. "Mom, is everything all right?" She could barely speak, her voice broken and filled with fear. "Oliver, please come. They're hurting me. I don't know what to do." A pause. And then, his voice, firm and resolute. "I'm coming, Mom. Hold on. I'm on my way." The officers, seemingly unfazed by Mrs. Ruby's frantic call, tightened their grip on her arm, pulling her toward the back of the store with a force that felt unnecessarily rough. She struggled to keep up, her legs protesting with every step, her mind racing to process what was happening. Her heart hammered against her chest as she tried to catch her breath, feeling both her dignity and strength slipping away with each passing second. One of the officers, a tall, heavy-set man with a hardened face, glanced at her with thinly veiled disdain. He hadn't even taken a moment to check her bag or look at her receipt. It was as if, in his mind, she was already guilty. The look in his eyes was one Mrs. Ruby recognized well, a look that had followed her throughout her life. A look that said, "I've already made up my mind about you." Desperate to clear her name, Mrs. Ruby tried once more. "Please, just look at my receipt," she pleaded, her voice soft but filled with a dignity she refused to let go of. "I paid for everything." The second officer, younger and seemingly uncomfortable, glanced at his colleague, perhaps with a sliver of doubt in his eyes. But the senior officer merely shook his head, his grip unyielding. "We've heard that before," he scoffed. "You'll explain yourself in the back." With each step, Mrs. Ruby felt her body weakening. It wasn't just the physical strain but the emotional toll of being treated like a criminal. The looks of strangers, the whispers, the judgment. It was as though she had become invisible, reduced to nothing more than a suspect in the eyes of those around her. Finally, they reached the back room, a small, stark space with a single metal chair and a table. They pushed her into the chair, the metal cold against her back, a harsh reminder of the reality she was now facing. "Stay here," one officer commanded. "We're going to have a look through your things." He spoke as if she were a child being reprimanded, his tone condescending and dismissive. Mrs. Ruby took a shaky breath, clasping her hands tightly in her lap to steady herself. Her fingers trembled as she watched them sift through her shopping bag, checking every item with exaggerated suspicion. Each move felt like an assault on her character, a stripping away of the respect she had earned over a lifetime of honesty and integrity. The younger officer cleared his throat, glancing at the older man. "Sir, I think we should check her receipt." The older officer shot him a glare. "I'll handle this." Mrs. Ruby watched them, her heart pounding, praying that Oliver would arrive soon. She had no doubt he would come, but the fear still gnawed at her, casting dark shadows over her mind. She knew the system, knew how often people who looked like her were wrongfully accused, and she feared, that they might not even listen to her son. She closed her eyes, swallowing her anxiety, and silently prayed. She prayed not just for herself, but for all those who had ever been in her shoes. Her mind drifted to memories of her life, of the struggles she had faced, and how she had always managed to overcome them with grace. This, she told herself, would be no different. But deep down, she couldn't deny the feeling of helplessness creeping in. As Mrs. Ruby sat alone in the cold, unforgiving room, she clutched her phone in her hands, holding on to it like a lifeline. Oliver was her only hope now, and the thought of him coming to her rescue gave her a flicker of strength. Meanwhile, Oliver was already on his way, his mind racing as he drove through the busy streets toward the mall. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. The tremor of fear that he had never heard from her before shook him to his core. Growing up, she had been the strongest person he knew, the woman who had raised him with kindness and resilience. To hear her in such distress was both enraging and heart-wrenching. He was a captain at the local precinct, and he had handled countless high-pressure situations, but this was different. This was personal. The thought of his mother, a woman who had lived her life with integrity, being treated like a criminal made his blood boil. But he knew he couldn't let his anger cloud his judgment. He needed to stay calm, to approach this situation with the same discipline he had always relied on. As he pulled into the mall parking lot, he took a deep breath, steadying himself. He couldn't afford to lose control now. His mother was depending on him. Oliver entered the mall, his eyes scanning the crowd until he saw a gathering near the back of one of the stores. People were whispering, casting glances toward the back room, and he knew instantly that was where his mother had been taken. With firm, measured steps, he made his way through the crowd, his face set in a mask of calm determination. He wasn't just here as a son. He was here as an officer of the law, a man who understood the weight of justice and the cost of prejudice. Finally, he reached the back room, and without a moment's hesitation, he opened the door, stepping inside. Inside the room, Mrs. Ruby looked up, her tear-streaked face lighting up with relief as she saw her son. The two officers turned, taken aback by the sudden intrusion. Oliver's presence was commanding, his expression calm yet undeniably intimidating. "Mom," he said softly, a gentle reassurance in his voice. "Are you all right?" Mrs. Ruby nodded, her hands still trembling, but a spark of hope returned to her eyes. "I am now," she whispered. The older officer frowned, stepping forward with a dismissive sneer. "Sir, this is a private matter. You need to leave." Oliver turned to him, his gaze unwavering. "This is very much my business," he said, his voice steady. "That's my mother you're holding." The officer's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "Then I suggest you back off. We're handling a case of suspected theft here, and we don't need any interference." Oliver's jaw tightened, his patience wearing thin. He took a step closer, his gaze never wavering. "You're accusing a 70-year-old woman of theft without any evidence and ignoring her attempts to prove her innocence. All she asked was for you to look at her receipt." The older officer shifted uncomfortably, a hint of defensiveness in his posture. He tried to mask it with a smug look, but Oliver wasn't fooled. He could see through the facade, the thinly veiled prejudice that had led these men to treat his mother with such disrespect. The younger officer, clearly uncomfortable, glanced between Oliver and his partner. "Maybe we should just check her receipt," he mumbled. But the older officer held his ground. "We follow protocol here. If you interfere any further, I'll have to call the police." At that, Oliver's eyes narrowed, and he reached into his jacket, pulling out his badge. He held it up for both men to see. "I am Captain Oliver Jenkins, 15th Precinct," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that sent a shiver down the officers' spines. "So please, by all means, call the police." The two officers stared at him, the realization dawning on them like a cold slap to the face. The younger officer's face drained of color, while the older one stammered, his arrogance quickly fading in the face of authority. "Captain?" the older officer mumbled, releasing his grip on Mrs. Ruby's arm as though it had burned him. We didn't know. We were just following orders." Oliver took a deep breath, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. Following orders? Or just following assumptions? His tone was sharp, each word hitting like a hammer. "You looked at her and made a judgment without a second thought, without considering that she might be innocent." The officers were silent, their heads hung in shame. Oliver turned to his mother, his expression softening as he gently took her hand. "Are you all right, Mom?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Mrs." Ruby nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm okay now," she said, her voice trembling with relief and gratitude. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by Mrs. Ruby's soft, shaky breaths. The officers shifted uncomfortably, clearly shaken by the realization of whom they had been dealing with. But it was more than just fear of rank that now weighed on them. It was the recognition of the terrible mistake they had made. They looked at each other, as if trying to find an excuse or an escape, but none existed. The younger officer took a small step forward, clearing his throat. "Captain Jenkins, we're sorry. We didn't mean—" His voice trailed off, the words feeling empty even to him. Oliver kept his gaze fixed on the officers, his face expressionless but his eyes sharp. "Do you know what it feels like to be accused of something you didn't do?" he asked, his voice cold and controlled. "To be judged without a second thought, based on assumptions and appearances alone?" The officers looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "It was never our intention," the older officer began, but Oliver cut him off. "Intentions don't excuse actions. You've embarrassed my mother, humiliated her, and treated her with disrespect because you assumed you knew her based on a look," Oliver said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it held the weight of thunder. "What if this had been your mother?" A silence followed that seemed to stretch for eternity, as the officers stared at the floor, their faces reddening with shame. Finally, Oliver took a breath, his anger still simmering but controlled. He turned to his mother, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "Let's go, Mom." As they began to leave, the younger officer, barely above a whisper, said, "Captain, please. We didn't mean to. I'm so sorry." Oliver paused for a moment, looking over his shoulder. "You need to reflect on why you thought you were right," he said quietly, then added, "and remember that justice doesn't come from prejudice or pride." With that, he led his mother out of the room, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders as they made their way through the mall. He could feel the eyes of onlookers following them, whispers echoing in the air. But this time he didn't care. All that mattered was getting his mother to a place where she could finally feel safe. As they exited the mall, Mrs. Ruby felt the weight of the ordeal lifting slightly, though her hands were still shaking. She looked up at her son, her eyes brimming with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. Oliver had always been her rock, her protector, and today, he had proven once again that he would stand by her side, no matter the cost. They reached the car, and Oliver opened the door for her, helping her settle into the seat before getting in on the other side. For a moment, they sat in silence, the events of the past hour hanging between them like a shadow. Finally, Mrs. Ruby spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Oliver. I don't know what I would have done without you." He reached over, taking her hand gently. "Mom, you never have to face anything like this alone," he replied, his voice soft but firm. "You raised me to stand up for what's right. Today it was my turn to stand up for you." She smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I just don't understand why they thought why they looked at me that way." Oliver's face hardened, his jaw clenching. "Some people only see what they want to see, Mom, but that's not your burden to carry." Mrs. Ruby nodded, still shaken, but comforted by her son's words. She squeezed his hand, a silent reminder of the strength they shared, a bond that no prejudice could ever break. Over the next few days, word of the incident spread throughout the community, sparking discussions and debates about prejudice, respect, and the responsibility that comes with authority. The security officers involved were placed under review, their actions scrutinized by both their employers and the public. One afternoon, Mrs. Ruby received a formal letter of apology from the mall's management, along with a promise to improve training for their staff to prevent future incidents. While the apology did little to erase the memory of what she had endured, it was a small step toward accountability, and it brought her a sense of closure. Oliver, however, made sure that justice didn't stop there. He filed a formal complaint with the local precinct's Internal Affairs Division, ensuring that the officers would face appropriate consequences for their actions. He wanted to send a message not just for his mother, but for anyone who had ever been wrongfully accused, disrespected, or dehumanized. As the weeks passed, Mrs. Ruby found herself reflecting on the ordeal. She had always known that life could be unfair, but this experience had taught her that there was a strength within her that no amount of prejudice could ever take away. One afternoon, as she sat by her window, sipping her favorite tea, Oliver stopped by to visit. He joined her, sitting across from her with a warm smile, a silent reminder that he was always there for her. "Mom," he said, his voice soft, "I want you to know that I'll always be there to stand up for you, just like you've always stood up for me." She smiled, reaching across the table to take his hand. "I know, Oliver, and I hope that what happened can help change things. Maybe, in some small way, this will make a difference." Oliver nodded, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "It already has, Mom. People are talking about it, questioning their own assumptions. And that's how change starts." They sat in peaceful silence, both knowing that while the world was far from perfect, they would face it together. For Mrs. Ruby, the incident had not defined her. It had simply reminded her of the love and resilience that had carried her through life. And for Oliver, it had reaffirmed his commitment to justice, not just as a police officer, but as a son. The lesson they shared would ripple outward, a quiet reminder of the power of respect, the courage of conviction, and the enduring strength of family. Months passed since the incident, but the story of Mrs. Ruby Jenkins continued to live on in the community. Her experience became a powerful reminder of the issues that could arise from unchecked assumptions and biases. People who had heard about what happened began reflecting on their own actions, conversations, and even the silent judgments they often made without a second thought. Mrs. Ruby's story, retold by friends, family, and neighbors, had turned into a quiet movement toward a more understanding community. In response to public outcry, the mall management took proactive steps, implementing new training programs focused on respect and empathy. Employees were taught to approach every situation with fairness and to look beyond assumptions. The community applauded these efforts, recognizing them as steps toward creating a safer, more respectful environment for everyone.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.